And you get these figureheads like Bezos and Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, which I think are also kind of plants. Hears or thinks
plants?
about them. They also own the media, so keeps people away from talking about these more sinister, dark things that are going on.
Well, there's a conspiracy on the fact that Amazon, it's funny,
I
Amazon
love this one.
executives have been known to leave Amazon and then go run another company that ultimately was a competitor, and somehow these companies are then going bankrupt or closing shop or selling out to Amazon.
Yep.
It's like back in the day, propaganda always seemed so much easier because there wasn't really an easy way to confirm or deny what was going on the ground. It's back. Everyone's like, oh, well, social media, people can post stuff and show all stuff. No, they can't.
When I was broke, I had rich habits.
Okay, welcome to the Master Keys. This is the long-awaited, much-anticipated conspiracy episode, but I am Chandler Haliburton.
I'm Neal and Andreino.
This is a podcast that's normally about real estate investing and wealth building because that's what we do for a living. We've built our portfolios to, a couple hundred units in a short period of time too, which is exciting. So this community is about sharing that. We can all grow together. But you guys came out, you supported. You hit the goal count of, I think it was only 100 likes on the video, and now our new video is up around 200 likes. So all this is super exciting. You guys can see what a difference it makes for us in the algorithm. Whoa, the canopy didn't last long.
I
Get
can't,
that back on there.
I can't. It's not staying.
Get back
it's
on
not
there.
Staying. All right, I'll do it for the first conspire.
So, we've talked about this episode for a while, and I think people need to listen to this one because it's going to be a lot of fun. And we're just going to throw out some ideas. But also, man, I went down the rabbit hole of like a little history lesson on like multinational corporations and how we got to where we are, which is essentially a deader Western world and so on. So what?
Yeah, I just want to quickly explain the reason. Yeah, so we got the 100 likes. You guys wanted it. We also kept kind of digressing whenever we were talking about stuff with our random conspiracies. I was really bad for it because I came up with random ideas in the middle of things. I'm like, but do you think it's because of this? And Chandler also was a nut.
No, I love that about you, you nutty little bugger.
So Chandler has a lot of information on, like you said, a lot of the corporate stuff and kind of the history of like the big conspiracy theories. Yeah. And then I just have a few that I kind of like have personally thought of and kind of have things that I think about sometimes. I'm like, is this how this really is? So, I think let's dive into your stuff and start walking people through it so they understand.
Yeah, as always, if you're having fun with this particular episode, even if you just like the way Neal looks in tinfoil, press a like. I would love to hear any of your crazy conspiracies that you can throw down on the comments here. What's that?
So that's an OnlyFans thing.
What's that?
Me wearing the tinfoil?
Oh, yeah. The full tinfoil and a little bit of saran wrap is at our Patreon if you want to see Neal in that. So don't forget to hop over onto there. But so it's funny. The more I do this, like, all right, conspiracies are interesting because they suggest an agenda and like an organized plot towards something. And I think that there is that going on in droves now. But I think it's important to understand how we got here to this modern economy, this modern world.
COVID was like the biggest like conspiracy pot turning thing of recent times. It just got everyone reinvigorated.
100%. And then there's the Great Reset, and we're going to get to all this stuff. But backtracking a little bit, a lot of this comes back to, transnational or multinational corporations. And then so it got me thinking about, well, what is a corporation and how did they evolve to have the strength that they do? So corporation comes from like the Latin corpus, which means a body of people. And originally when the idea of corporations came together, it was so that a group of people could act as one sort of legal entity. And it's interesting, when they were first founded, the idea of them, they had to have two things. One, they had to have one stated mission, and they had to work for the common good of the people. And people will laugh if they hear that idea of a corporation now because that's not necessarily what they do. It's maybe kind of the opposite. But that was the idea of what it meant to form a corporation. And then something really curious happened. If you're familiar with American history and the 14th Amendment, which most people associate with freed slaves, and it outlines there in the 14th Amendment how every individual is equal under the eyes of law. But there's this interesting caveat there that says corporations also are effectively people and are likewise equal under the eyes of law, which allowed them to do a couple things, enter contracts, litigate and sue, but also things like they could have a corporation could have effectively a religious belief. They could lobby, they could donate, and that started to trickle into the influence of corporations over time. And it's such a crazy idea, but you remember when this came up a few years ago when there was all the marriage debates in the States and abortion rights in the States, and corporations, like this is why technically if you're a corporation, you can refuse service to someone based on your supposed religious affiliation, is because under American law, thanks to the 14th Amendment, corporations are effectively people.
Yeah.
So that's a crazy cool history and why they are now protected and able to do things like lobby governments and donate, things that you'd think should never be allowed, but that's why. If you go kind of, again, back in history, it's like, well, why aren't there laws against this? Well, there actually are. They're called antitrust laws. You've probably heard of them. And they kind of were founded because back in the day, the old school big barons of American history, which like your J.P. Morgan, your Rockefeller, they controlled like railways, production, steel, and those were called trusts. Like you were a big steel trust. And it got to the point where consumers were like, this is ridiculous. We're being gouged by these companies because they're so big, they're so powerful.
No other choice.
Yeah. So all these antitrust laws were established to effectively prevent monopolies from happening. And for a while, they did a good job of that. If any corporation got too big, they'd be broken up. And you still see this a little bit today. Like whenever,
a lot with Facebook and a lot of the tech companies now.
Yeah.
Amazon. Facebook was the biggest one recently, where Zuckerberg was in there, and they made all the memes of him looking.
Well, you know how
he wears a tinfoil hat.
You know how even like in our industry, we got cracked down on because of the MLS and realtor system. They were saying was like too much of a monopoly, and we were hoarding this information, and that was detrimental to the public. And likewise, anytime you see one of these major airlines in Canada talk about merging, they have to have these hearings say like, all right, is this for the best of Canadians? Same thing, telecommunications. Is a big one, right? So there's all these laws supposedly in place to prevent corporations from, becoming so big that they can exploit and take advantage of the public. So these antitrust laws were put into effect, and for a long time they worked until essentially they didn't. Because what happens was, like all these things were kind of moving simultaneously, but for the first half of the 20th century, you can say that there were relatively strong antitrust laws, and the American economy was doing, coming out of the recession, and especially coming out of the Second World War, the American economy really started to grow. And then you get this simultaneous thing of the baby boomer generation. And the baby boomers are interesting because they're the first generation that really grew up with the American dream. Like the successful people of the American dream were always happening, but those baby boomers were instilled with this idea of the American dream and really a value placed on education, i.e. university, right? We talked about this a lot in the last episode.
Do you feel the American dream is something that was created by the corporations?
Oh, here we go. All right, good. Neil's diving right into it.
I mean, we're here to conspire.
Yeah, I think that, what I think of the university and the university, like the big business of American universities is hugely corrupt, and it has sold people on this fake idea of the American dream, or at least like, this idea that you have to have a degree to get ahead, and in order to get that degree, you have to take on more debt than anyone else has ever taken on before in like the history of mankind. It makes no sense for the government to.
So you're saying the universities and the educational institutions have kind of created the idea that it's a requirement.
Oh, 100%, right? Like
Why do you think corporations have been into it though? Where most positions now require you to have a degree.
Why have they done it? Oh gosh. I mean, I think there's probably a pretty heavy link between a lot of these major corporations and these universities, because especially down in the States, like a couple things that are crazy. In the U.S., like universities and colleges don't pay taxes. Like they are tax exempt. And that includes the big football stadium where you go there, you pay all the money, you buy your beer, you buy your hot dogs, you buy the jerseys, and they get all these TV contracts.
Cashing that in.
That is tax free, right? And the corporations know that, all right, well, we want to be the firm that builds that stadium. We want to be the supplier for, the waste removal on campus. Like we want all those things. So the corporations actively feed into this university institutional like system that's been created. And also they're oftentimes heavily connected to the banking institutions, which then make money off the interest.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Back to the American dream. Do you think that whole concept is corporately created?
Oh man, I think
the education thing, to what you said, to respond to that though, I agree with what you're saying, especially in the States. In Canada, I don't find it as prevalent, but I do think there is merit in getting a degree.
totally.
There is merit in doing it. I didn't love doing mine, but I do think I learned things and I became a stronger mind than if I hadn't have gone.
But you're preaching to the choir, man. Like I taught for a while. Like I worked in universities. I did a bunch of degrees. Like
But-
I believe in the value of education.
Totally, but the way, like you said, the way they set it up, the amount of money that they charge, and in the States, it's a lot more prevalent that they overcharge like crazy.
Yeah.
And then they have really weird background things, like you said, they don't pay any taxes, they don't pay some of their student athletes, but they charge for all those things when they're there. So there is a lot of weird stuff that goes on with that. I guess my thing is with the American dream as a whole, which is a super massive topic. We'll probably get into this for a bit, but does that not seem like that was something that was created by corporations to benefit the corporations? Because if you look, and let me explain my thought on this is the American dream. The idea is that you get out of your house, you become your own strong, independent family, you purchase a home, you purchase your own car, you purchase your own lifestyle, and the more that you purchase, the better you're doing in that dream. And when you look at other countries in the world, lots of families still live under one single roof. And even as they've developed to be more first world, they're just continuing to live within one family home. They're sharing things within it. And we'll see it here. A lot of our immigrants that come here, even if they have very, really good means and they've done very well, they still live under one roof.
Yeah.
They still share everything they have. They're still more resourceful in what they use. But here it's this idea that it's I'm successful. The dream is based on me being able to just be more almost wasteful in some sense.
Yeah, it's funny how these things kind of evolve over time, and I think you can make an argument that early on the American dream would have been promoted by the government because this whole thing, ask not what your government can do for you or your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, right? There's this idea that you are individually responsible for making your own way, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you can't afford university, well, you need to work a little bit harder, right? Because the American dream is you're going to work hard, and then we promise you there will be a payoff. If you work hard enough, we promise you that there will be a payoff. And I think as a government, you can see the merits of that because then you don't have to provide as much. You can say, well, if you're not thriving in life, that's probably your own fault. And then I think what you're talking about is more the consumerism that became associated with that.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that came out of this baby boomer generation because you had this suburban sprawl and you kind of had this shift between this idea, maybe a bit more rural idea of owning real assets. You owned businesses, you owned lands, you owned capital that produce, even if it was a tractor, you owned stuff that had inherent value. And with suburban sprawl, you start to get this idea of keeping up with the Joneses, which even though it was, I think, from a comic strip that was at the start of the 20th century, you really it really became part of contemporary culture, in around the 1950s, this idea of, we now have black and white TVs in the home and then color TVs in the home and everyone buys a vehicle and, we get the above ground pool and that, lifestyle, that middle class suburban lifestyle became about creature comforts and niceties. And then you have this idea of, well, maybe the American dream became tied to materialism and consumerism. And so now it's maybe not just the government that has a vested interest in the American dream, but also, corporations.
Yeah.
Right? Because once consumer culture really exploded, which is in the second half of the 20th century, you got the advent of money lending. So GM was kind of one of the first major companies to finance, and in 1920 they started to give you loans to buy your vehicles, and then in 1930 they did the same for your appliances, and this coincided with people starting to have cars and have appliances in their home. And the first Diners Club card was in 1950, and the Bank America card or Bank America card was 1958, and that became Visa. And by the 1960s to the 1980s, you started to get actual credit reporting, what we now think of as Equifax, and that all came in the second half of the 20th century as this middle class interest in having, what we would call now luxuries, right?
Yeah.
Right. Everyone had to have it. It was keeping up with the Joneses, and with that came consumer debt. And what's curious is all of this stuff was kind of coming to a head in the 70s and 80s, which is also the time that government got off gold-backed currency.
Yep.
There was a big push towards really cheap money. So there was kind of this boom in the late 60s into the early 70s, not dissimilar to what we have now, which is a period then all of a sudden like money was cheap, everything was humming along, consumer debt was going through the roof. Like it's something like the consumption went from 60% of the GDP to what now is about 70%, which is quite a bit. Household debt jumped dramatically from basically being non-existent up until the 70s. It grew and grew and grew. And then this is very similar to what we have now, which was there's this period of crazy inflation in the early 1970s. And we're talking like, double-digit inflation. Like we're panicked now where it's like 7 and 8%.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking like 14% inflation in the early 1970s.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about that a bit, but the inflation numbers now might be higher if we got a true accurate representation, because those inflation numbers from back then better encompass the actual goods that people consumed versus today. But another thing I just thought of, and this is not to go back and not to be flip-flopping everywhere, but on the education thing, it's interesting that the government's now trying to bail out a bunch of student loans, which would mean that they're incentivizing people to go to school by offering all these new options to take student loans, pay less, forgive more. And it's weird that they would support that industry. But on the flip side, as a government, I think the idea is the more people that are educated, the higher their country performs as a whole, the more the country is respected, and the efficiency and production per worker in their country grows. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and to what you're saying, like, yeah, the debt thing is when things really started to kind of go ballistic.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's this great quote, I don't know who it's by, but like, as soon as you take a debt, you're giving someone your liberty a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And if you want to talk about being enslaved to these big corporations and these big banks and even governments, like, well, debt's a quick way to get people under your thumb. Once like these periods of big booms that are followed by heavy inflation, that are followed by big recessions, you see how things start to move around during those times.
So we talk about, like you said, when the first time this happened back in the 80s, late 70s, they cranked rates through the roof. I think they didn't know exactly what to do and what was happening, and 100%, and they were trying to control and figure it out. I think since then, where they've done these fluctuations, that's being controlled.
Oh, totally.
Like what I think what's going on right now. Like these are things that have been designed and created to help benefit the larger corps. Yeah. And I think they're the ones that are pushing and pulling the levers you always refer to. They're the ones that have the ability to do this. But can we jump right into like the COVID stuff and the money making printing that's going on right now and kind of the China's backing on it?
Totally. Let's take it there.
Okay, so like Chandler just referred to what happened in the 80s. So we had this happen now, but it was kind of artificially forced by printing a ton of money. And what did they do to make them print a ton of money? We had COVID. I feel that the COVID concept, like I feel like that's a manufactured disease or like sickness or what I don't even know what it's labeled as, but I think that was created virus. It's a virus that was created, honestly.
Well, they're. I mean, people are going to think that's absolutely absurd.
Oh, totally.
But there's very strong evidence that it was being cultured in a lab.
Yeah, right? I'm not saying it's fake. Like, I'm not saying like that people didn't get COVID, people didn't die, people didn't get sick. Like I totally believe that all took place, but I'm just not convinced that it just was formed out of a wet market in China.
Yeah, I think that has kind of been debunked purely. I don't think this is like someone ate a bat and like there was a problem as a result. Like it is not uncommon for, bioscientists or whatever their title would be to experiment with different cultures of different variants, and there has
accidental releases and stuff too.
Yeah, totally. And there has been reporting of these labs saying, "Listen, we want to get ahead of these virus mutations, and the best way to do that is to mutate the viruses ourselves and see how they evolve and continue to combat them." Right. And it's easier to combat them in a lab preemptively than, to let nature take its course. And they had made an application to do this, one of these labs, that was refused because, it seems a little bit risky. And then, interestingly, not many years later, there are links to that same lab with this original variant of the coronavirus that's caused us so much grief.
And, I genuinely believe that this coronavirus is a fight from China on the States. I actually do. I think, I've talked about this before a couple times. I'm like, New World Order. It a lot of things line up to that. And when you look at what took place, through COVID, the yuan actually grew in value against the US dollar, right? This has helped benefit their currency. The US has been absolutely demolished. And the other thing that's weird, with China, it's how much of it is legit? They show those videos of them locking doors, welding doors shut, this, that, and the other thing. I'm like, part of me is are they doing that to try and make us think like this is how crazy things are going and that they're getting hit just as hard, or are they not like actually taking like their case numbers were really like, again, we don't know, like case numbers, they were saying they weren't getting any cases for a while, like they have so many weird things like that. And so my thing is, did they do this to cause an absolute downward pressure on the US currency?
I think it was more the best defense is a good offense. I think they saw what was going to happen in their own economy, and we've talked about the collapse of their economy. That is also very real, right? Like there's some terrible things. Oh, Neal's getting called right now from his
Xi Jinping. What?
just a laser just takes Neal out. I mean, I think they saw the writing on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's explore your.
Let me finish. Like here's my thing. Like this is the other thing is like how far can you go with it? Where it's like, do you believe anything that's coming out of China? It's like even like with their so-called crash and this and that. Like they have so much strength for how much money they receive from the States. Like this is so I'm
let's go.
I'm big on the New World Order concept. Like I believe that like when you look at a timeline, everything's kind of gone that way. The States now, their growth is starting to taper in a lot of ways. They send a ton of money overseas, predominantly to China, and now they're going through a lot of turmoil. I feel like they're almost in a weak place politically, and so all of those things are adding up. China's the strongest it's ever been. They've come to the first world in a big way. They're expanding their military, their navy, their air force like at an insane pace. They have a crazy amount of people. And they make no bones about it. Like they want to take over. Like they have built railroads, airports, shipping ports in like every country around the world, pretty much. And they're trying to basically, they offer them. They say, hey, it's free of charge, no big deal, whatever. And well, you repay us over time, and if you can't repay us, then we'll just take ownership of it. And so they went to a bunch of places that would have no chance of ever repaying it. So now they have bases literally across the world. They're aggressively been buying in Canada. They buy up a ton of real estate in both countries. Additionally, like China has been known to buy infrastructure-based companies. Like China put a bid on Aecon, which is the largest infrastructure company for us here in Canada, that builds our roads, highways, railroads, shipping ports, the whole shebang. Thank God the government stopped that, but that would have been like, they have control over our ability, because if a war takes place, like Aecon Group's going to have to step up to the plate to help build out a lot of stuff really fast. So I'm like, I think they're doing that. The other thing, like to tie in, is like, it was funny how there's this concept of like the shipping issues, like Evergrande. I was thinking about this last night. It's kind of funny. The company that owned that ship is Evergreen. The ship was called, what was it, Evergiven, and now their real estate company in China is Evergrande. And I'm like, all these things, I'm like, they sound very similar. They start with the same concept. I'm like, it's just weird how all this stuff's going on. Like it's like the Panama Canal thing at the same time. So we're having this now deflationary pressure on our dollar, and then now China's like, oh, let's cause this, and it's going to put more inflationary pressure on purchasing goods from us now too, which means we can charge more, we can funnel even more money out, put more strain on the general consumer in there, put more debt in them. Like I think it benefited them in a lot of ways. The other thing that was weird, like the Panama Canal, I'm just going to quickly mention this. Like I'm going off because it's just like this is all the shit that I think about, but like.
Good.
That ship crashed. You know how many ships get stuck in there? Like there's ships that get stuck in there all the time, and they're pulled out within 5 to 12 hours. Like it's weird that this ship somehow got stuck for a week. And it said they're costing hundreds of millions of dollars a day, and they had 2 excavators out there digging. What? Are you kidding me? Like if it's costing that much money, could you not have floated over like 50 excavators and had that thing unstuck in like 10 minutes? Like that made no sense to me, that every other ship that's ever gotten stuck in there, which is like, I'm pretty sure a weekly occurrence because it is a tight run, they yanked them out. No big deal. And I understand that this one got wedged up, but like
we're getting all
I'm getting all over the place. But it all boils back to I truly believe that this whole thing is an attack from China on the States. Like I think we're getting into
I think you're giving them
fishy turmoil.
No, I think you're right. I do think that some of it was also them realizing their own situation. Right, like they play chess while the world plays checkers. I guess if you want to go that route, in terms of their like kind of they kind of have this debt and supply based colonialism, right? They're like, we are going to, in debt, like we're going to put you in debt to us, and like that quote I said too, like that's you giving us your liberty, and then these slow kind of this production and this supply chain that they are controlling, also kind of is their passive way that they colonize. Like the Western world, we come in guns blazing and we just colonize, and they're like they do it very it's very visual, it's very offensive, and it's right in your grill. Whereas, how do I turn this thing off? Man, I gotta
Silent mode.
Yeah, that's. Whereas I think the Chinese thing has been more of a slow drip, right? Like it's harder to notice when, again, they just take on the world's debt, they continue to expand, everyone's heavily reliant on them. So I think they have been doing that behind the scenes for, decades and decades and decades. I think they also, though, did see what was going on in their own economy, and they were like, okay, we've got a couple options here, or we got a couple problems brewing. One, it's our own kind of debt crisis and real estate challenges. And from that is going to be a huge amount of civil unrest. So, and we're going to be weakened potentially financially. So what could we do to get ahead of this and, one, control our populace, and two, put pressure on the rest of the world so that we aren't in a weakened position relative to them, because they will also be in a weakened position. And that maybe is the argument for your grand conspiracy, which is like, all right, we control our own population by mandating that with a click of a button, we can isolate everyone. We literally infect the rest of the country and grind their economies to a halt. And then simultaneously, we do all these other workings where we drive inflation through the roof and devalue other countries' currencies, because we know that our own economy and our currency could be at risk. But if you devalued the US dollar, which is kind of the marker for the entire world, then that's going to come out in the wash and it's going to balance. So I think that is a.
We believe that they're having a crisis over there?
I do for sure.
Yeah?
Yeah, but I think like they have the stomach and the coffers to bear it.
Yeah, they also have the ability to change things like that to like make it happen. Like they're like, okay, we got too many houses, boom, we'll rip down 1 million of them, and now we're good to go again.
This is the other thing. If you want to take it even broader, like I wonder if they're the ones that are also helping to spread, and they would be doing this very covertly, this great reset. Because you keep hearing this, COVID's this great opportunity for us to rebuild the economy in a much more sustainable way. And yeah, it's going to be expensive, and we're all going to have to make sacrifices, but, we're going to do it, and blah, blah, blah. And we're each going to have to do our part. And, here in Canada, we're going to have these, more carbon taxes and all of this. And you know what they're doing in, like, China and these other emerging markets? They're like, now, you guys can do all that. We're just going to go over here and print money. We're going to still do it as cheap as we always have. We're still going to, in some respects, like oppress our own population. We're not going to care about the environment. And as a result, we're going to take the competitive advantage we already had on you, and we're going to run it through the roof. And we are kind of slowly poisoning our own economies with this moral superiority that we're trying to have over the rest of the world when it comes to things like climate change. And I'm a big believer in climate change. I just think that we've reached the point now where we're putting all this climate change stuff on individuals. And this is why some of these big corporations were behind all this, like, recycle, reuse, and reduce, and saying, it's at the individual consumer base. The problem with the pollution is that, Timmy and Sally aren't recycling enough, which is total BS, right? Like, it's the big corporations that are polluting the vast majority, probably like 90% of the world's carbon output is from these big corporations, but we're shifting responsibility onto individuals, and now we continue to do it. Like, I'm voting in favor of more taxes on me, and these other countries are just laughing at us.
Totally. We've talked about this before. It's like we're thinking it's all like going to be green and amazing. The thing I think with that, though, is I kind of disagree, is like the corporations are producing something that we all need and want. So it's like, if we're really going to make a point, then we're not going to buy from that corporation.
Man, and then we come back to this consumerist culture, which like just went through the roof. And
if you're going to buy from them, they have to make it some way.
Yeah.
The other option is you do want to pay 5 times the price for what you're getting.
Yeah.
And if you don't, then you'll go to somewhere else.
So just to go back again now into some history as to like how this happened. So you had this massive inflation in the early 70s, and really bad monetary policy where they didn't know what to do about. Like, they were literally printing money. They got away from gold backed standard. Inflation went through the roof, so they had to jack up interest rates, and this big kind of crazy time, not dissimilar to what we have now, only with rampant unemployment. And so someone, I can't remember who it was, but it was an economic advisor to one of the presidents during the 70s that said, all right, we need to revisit these antitrust laws, because what they were really about was not exploiting the consumer. Right? They weren't necessarily that saying that companies can't get too big or that monopolies are bad. What they were really about was what's best for the consumer. And in the 80s, there became this big push towards like, well, maybe big businesses are actually good because they're efficient. Right? Like, say what you will about McDonald's. They make a burger for pretty damn cheap.
Super cheap.
Right? The fact they have to raise the cattle, import the beef, bring it here, cook it, make the bread, put it like, and they still deliver that sucker to you for like $3. Like it's unbelievable. And so in times of massive inflation, what companies do well? Big corporations that have high efficiencies, Amazon's, McDonald's, Walmart, because they can do this stuff dirt cheap. So in the 80s, antitrust laws kind of got thrown out, and there was this push towards these big corporations that could reach these high efficiencies to start to bring pricing back down, because we're in a time of really problematic inflation. Again, not dissimilar to now. Like when we had the pandemic, where did everyone start shopping at? Online. Amazon went through the roof. Walmart. All these big corporations. Your mom and pops got destroyed. And maybe there's some behind-the-scenes workings there as well, because now these multinational corporations, they could say McDonald's, they could say Nike, and those sound American. They're not American, right? These are very much world corps now.
Now that you're on that topic, I got to say one thing. Not only did mom and pops fail, decently large corporations failed as well. There's a conspiracy on the fact that Amazon, it's funny, Amazon executives have been known to leave Amazon and then go run another company that ultimately was a competitor of Amazon. And somehow these companies are then going bankrupt or closing shop or selling out to Amazon.
Yep.
And it's weird how it's happened multiple times.
It seems
now.
like Toys R Us and what that Bed Bath, was it Bed Bath Beyond?
One of the
or
home sense types.
bathroom,
One of those companies did it as well. And so you're seeing the Amazon network like going out into the world and then nuking these companies or bringing them
exactly.
in-house.
They these companies think they're being smart because they kind of poach these executives from Amazon.
Amazon,
and they say,
the
like,
best
listen,
growing company
we
ever.
want you to move us online the same way that Amazon is online. And then all of a sudden those companies go out of business. There is this whole behind the scenes working, like is Amazon going out there and poison pilling all of their big rivals. But part of this, how they were allowed to do this and how these corporations were able to grow to this extent is because there was this push towards efficiencies and big corporations. And then from that, multinational corps or transnational corps that were allowed to exist outside, like they may be quote unquote American, but they're not actually American or they're not actually Canadian. They exist, in cheaper markets around the world. So by the 1970s, it was something like 1/3 of capital assets in the U.S. were actually owned, or 1/3 of capital assets owned by U.S. companies were actually outside of the U.S. So they started to expand, and in exchange, trade now. We're promoting cheaper trade and opening our trade doors to countries like China who are just like, yeah, we can do it cheaper because we don't pay our people as much. We don't have these stringent standards, and that started our societal indebtedness to big corporations, many of which that have ties to China. I don't know what's going on. What have we been talking about? It's all crazy. It's all a mix. But thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying this, getting anything out of it, don't forget to like, subscribe, all that. Maybe share something in here that you think's a little funky that someone else might like. Or if you've got a wicked conspiracy theory, don't forget to put it down there below. Trying to get as many likes as possible, man. Let's see how many eyes we can get on this weird stuff. We're going to continue to talk about the real estate market, the housing market, and what conspiracy elements are out of that. Neal's on about COVID and how that might be manipulated. Of course, I'm focused on the corporation stuff, all this crazy stuff. Keep watching.
Give me a conspiracy.
What's that?
Give me a conspiracy.
So...
Everyone knows the history now. They know the background.
Yeah.
They're educated.
So I think that, when you see, some of these big national companies got into or exist in the banking world. And we saw the next big ride up of cheap money was in the early 2000s, and there was the housing boom, and then the housing market collapsed in 2007, and there's all kinds of corruption there that isn't even really conspiracy theory. It's just like fact. Like these were bad mortgages, high risk. The money was cheap. The market was going up. So these companies were lending these, and then these mortgages were being sold, and then these mortgage-backed securities were being sold, and it was a literal pyramid scheme that all collapsed. And then there was a big recession between 2007 and 2010 where the average person got noticeably poorer and statistically numbers-wise poorer, but the actual richest 1% continued to get larger and larger. So then you had the Occupy movement in 2011, which everyone may remember, may not. That's a long time ago for you, Neal. You were only 15 years old.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay.
I wasn't part of this
a
movement.
bunch of hippies. I know, just kidding. The big Occupy movement was, a group of people that went down to Wall Street, and they didn't have a clear-cut agenda, which was part of their downfall. But effectively, they were saying, we are the 99%. We are the average person. We are far the majority, and we have a small share of money, and it's because of all this corruption. It's because of Wall Street. It's because of big business and corporations and all that. And they kind of started this movement that spread around the world. And eventually disbanded, was broken down, and it ended. And the question is, well, what actually came out of it? Because all those companies got bailouts anyway, and, you can make some ties to maybe like an increased left presence in politics, whether it's Bernie Sanders or anything like that. However, I think there's something more sinister that went on, because this is also the same time as the Arab Spring was going on Facebook. And I think these big corporations took two things out of that sort of changed the world. One, they realized the power of social media to organize people.
Yeah.
And that if a disorganized entity that literally in their own mandate was like, we don't have a hierarchy, there's no leader of the Occupy movement, this is just free-flowing, blah, blah, blah. If they could mobilize this many people to cause this much unrest, imagine what you could do with social media if you had an agenda. Same thing with the Arab Spring. Like that showed big corporations and lobby groups, which, reminder, corporations can lobby and do whatever they want now. They realized the power of social media, and then you have things like election tampering, different narratives that are maybe not true, conspiracy theories, etc. The other thing they realized is like, oh my gosh, these people didn't move the decimal far enough. It's not 99 and 1%. It's 99.9 and 0.1%, if we're being realistic.
Yeah.
And what was realized within that is like, oh my gosh, there's a chance to scapegoat the 1%, because the actual 0.1% exists on another plane. Like it is another universe that we don't even really know how they're existing. And you get these figureheads like Bezos and Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, which I think are also kind of plants, because they're these rock star, oddly popular figureheads, but they're the actual corporations that are out there. No one really hears or thinks about them. I don't know that they're plants
by the government.
I think the true 0.1% corporate world.
Who's the evil one? Bezos? He's the evil one. Bezos is evil. Elon's
I think
cool.
they're just there to be like,
Zuckerberg's
this
alien.
is the 0.1%. It's that guy, right? Give people something to point to. It's like, oh yeah, it's the guy that owns Amazon or the guy that owns Tesla or the guy that owns Facebook. They're the 0.1%. It's like, no, like the corporations that are doing the most sinister things around the world, they're not going to have a Jeff Bezos out there banging his drum. Like they're not going to be shooting each other into space. They move. Real G's move in silence, like lasagna, as Lil Wayne once said. These guys are moving on the stealth, and they're happy that you're over there staring at this stuff, which is also why they're happy you're distracted by the Kardashians, and they also own the media, so this sensory overload keeps people away from talking about these more sinister, dark things that are going on. So my conspiracy theory is that they saw this little social unrest and they realized it was a great opportunity to do a few things. One, mobilize on social media and kind of corrupt that space. Two, they realized that the average person already unconsciously realized they couldn't touch the 0.1%. So what they targeted was the 1%. Like the person working on Wall Street does make a lot of money, and that does make you angry, but they are not ruining your life, right? The people, the puppet masters that control all of Wall Street and that whole level of the economy, they're controlling some of these things, lobbying government, keeping pharmaceutical prices high, all that sort of stuff. But it's not the guy in your grade 12 class that you graduated with who now works for a hedge fund. It's not that dude, right? It's not the corporation that owns, 5 franchises in your neighborhood. But what they've managed to do is to convince you that those people are the problem, that those people aren't paying enough taxes. And so governments run on platforms that address, the richest 6 people you went to high school with, but does nothing to address the actual richest corporations in the world.
to go to the media thing, 'cause that's something that I'm like heavily like vested in the sense of like I'm interested in it. It's interesting right now. I'm seeing a couple places on YouTube where like YouTube pages that are producing maybe not the most honest or properly copyrighted material, and in any normal form, if they're an American company, would be banned from their ability to post on social media. But they're from other countries. They're able to maintain their presence online through our social media platforms simply because politically, if YouTube or an American corporation bans one of these people from posting, it's actually more of a government political issue than it has nothing to do with the YouTube page. It's just like, whoa, this is like the one Russian YouTube page that's posting this stuff here. And if you ban that, like we're taking offense to that. Yeah. And so there's like a bunch of them that are getting that kind of stuff. So the media one blows my mind, and it's crazy. Like I'm with you on that. Like it's fully controlled at a higher level to manipulate all of us to what we're interested in, what we follow, and what we believe. The thing that blows my mind that I think it's like back in the day, propaganda always seemed so much easier because there wasn't really an easy way to confirm or deny what was going on the ground. It's back. Everyone's like, oh, well, social media, that people can post stuff and show all stuff. No, they can't. Like you can't post stuff. It gets reviewed. It gets pulled down. It gets flagged as sensitive content, or it just doesn't get promoted. Right? Like if you try and search for things on your phone that are from like the heart of Russia or the heart of China, you'll never find it. It's on there. They'll let you post it if you're in that person in China, but you'll never find it on your end of the phone, right? So like the propaganda game is back in a big way through the media.
Totally. And you know, this is my own bias, I suppose, but I think ironically the people who are hardest, you know, most philosophically and politically opposed on paper to say big corporations and, you know, the status quo and the system that exists, in a lot of cases do more damage than good because they think they're making progress. Like I'm a pure capitalist in a lot of ways. Like, so I see this stuff going on. I'm like, man, that's some corrupt shit. But, you know, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to focus. I'm going to put my head down. I'm going to get my piece of the pie.
Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of a don't hate the player, hate the game. Like this is the system we're in, and I'm gonna work on it. There's a lot of people who believe that they're making progress by setting up systems that tax people that are much closer to them than they think, right? And all that does is kind of actually hurt the middle class and you know, local job starts, because there's very little incentive to grow your small business past a certain point. There just is. And the reason there is because, you know, people have been convinced that as businesses get to a certain point, now they're the devil, they should be cut down and cut off at the knees. And all that is a misprojection of, we're mad at this over here, but this is another universe. We cannot touch that. We don't even really know it exists. Again, we see these figureheads, you know, but we don't know even what that plane is. So instead, we're just a little extra mad at the people who are wealthy around us. And as a result, you get bigger taxation and bigger government, and then you start advancing these causes that you think are good, be it ESG or carbon taxes and all these things, but all they do is further hurt the middle class. Like all of these things, when you have inflation, when you have bigger government, like at the end of the day, this plane way up here, it doesn't affect them. It doesn't affect them at all. It actually squeezes the people most at risk.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and so people are clamoring for this great reset and what it's going to mean and so on and so forth. And people want it in everything. They want housing to crash. You know, they want the dollar to crash. They want a fresh start. But more often than not, and you can look at this history, like anytime there has been terrible moments where things have crashed and there's been an opportunity for a reset, the corporations have come out of those stronger. Right? In the 80s, it was the openness of trade and the basic throwing away of antitrust laws that allowed these corporations to get bigger and bigger and bigger and then spread multinationally. You know, and then after the housing crisis, you know, these corporations just continue to grow. It's not like they got smaller. And here in this moment, you know, inflation is hurting the poorer earners, not the higher end earners, right? So every time after one of these, it just gets worse for, common folk and way better for the 0.1%. And then the people who are maybe in the top like 1 or 5% are just like, great. So now you're going to pass a bunch of laws because you're angry at them, and like all we're going to get is more taxation, more headache, less incentive to grow, and no one ends up better, right? Everyone just ends up a little bit more bitter.
Agreed. I'm just in my own little world now, thinking about a bunch of different things.
Fire them out. Let's go. Let's go.
Well, no, for me, it was, so going back to your point about how growing your business, like it gets to a point where it's so difficult to do, and like it's like they continue to put in rules, and there's so many things that you just can't get past. And I'm like, it's funny how like to grow your business, it's almost like you need to meet people in that next realm and have them help you get into that level. And it's like it goes all the way up the line. Like if you're like with your millionaires and your 10 millionaires and your 100 millionaires and your billionaires, and like that level of monetary income or monetary value, as well as the power that comes along with being in those positions and the relationships you need to have to get there. I think if anything, the tech guys are almost a different world that's been able to surpass that. Like in like standardized business practices, you have to network your way up, and I feel like they have to almost accept you to be able to do business with you. Like there's certain, like you just can't grow your business from a certain level to the next level if you don't have acceptance from that next level, because you're going to need them in some capacity, whether it's lending, whether it's a product that you buy
lobbying,
from them, lobbying,
influence,
influence, all those things. And I feel like that's why you see a lot of people get stuck at a certain point. But the tech world almost allowed them to go direct to consumer. It was a bit of a wild west at the start before they had all the controls in place. And so I think a lot of these guys that ran up really quickly didn't require kind of that acceptance of the upper echelon and were able to grow their businesses. And that's why you get some of these public figures that are more unique, I guess we'll say, like the Elon Musks, the Mark Zuckerbergs. Like they're unique characters, and they're different than everybody else in that world that have been in there, that have been a hierarchy for generations passed down to their families, and have been the big $1 trillion families that run everything, like the Rockefellers and all these kinds of people, where you never see them anywhere, and they have a very intensive code of conduct within their families and how they operate. So anyways, I was just going down that path, and I'm like, it's a weird world. Like I'm with you that there's a whole different playing field at the very top end that controls really what takes place on a day-to-day basis that we're not even really privy to. We don't even get an opportunity to think about it because it's never presented to us. And I think anyone who tries to present it gets nuked. Like I think now, again, where they have control over the social media platforms, like if they don't like what's going on or someone's starting to get too much traction, they can just cut you out. Like we all know or heard of YouTubers and Instagrammers and Facebook people and media personalities. What's that?
Shadow banned.
Yeah, exactly. And you instantly you just get canceled. Like, and it's not even just like because the public wants to cancel you. It's because something from above wants to cancel you, right? Or everyone has now heard of like YouTubers that were like a massive, and now their channels just continue to shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink as they cover more and more realistic material. So it's weird.
Yeah, there's different stages to this tomfoolery or whatever. Like the screwing has gone at different levels. I think consumer, like you sell someone on the American dream, right? Which for a long time was a way to kind of keep the public down a little bit. Say like, listen, it's up to you to bring yourself up by your own britches, period. And then you attach materialism to that American dream, and you sell people on this idea of like, all right, well, here's what success means. It means all these things, these items that all depreciate in value. It doesn't mean owning stuff. It means having possessions that depreciate in value. Well, how are you going to get those? Well, we're going to lend you money to get it, right? So you get this consumer culture that becomes a debt culture, and then, if you want to squeeze the middle class out and squeeze wealth to the top, what you do is you make money really cheap. You have a bunch of people take on debt, and then that debt system collapses. You have massive inflation. They effectively lose everything, which allows corporations to thrive. And then in that environment, you're like, don't worry, Big Brother will take care of you. And Big Brother's in the form of a huge corporation that can provide things for cheaper than your local provider, and everyone's happy for a little while. But then you get this sort of situation where people realize, oh my gosh, like I'm kind of stuck in servitude to these big corporations. And then I think you combine that with like, all right, well, someone's going to catch on to this, and it's probably going to be people who are maybe like highly educated. So what happens if all these people go get an education? They look around and say, well, this is some bullshit that's going on here. Well, one way to shut those people up is to bury them in debt. Right. So you've got these universities that have so much money and so much influence, and have so much influence upon them that can, sort of dictate what people are learning on the one hand, but also can bury them in debt because they are the gatekeepers to any sort of prosperity in the Western world. So if you bury them in debt, there's not really that much that they can do to you. In fact, they will, if anything, work harder for you to get themselves out of debt, and they will be thankful for the job at the same multinational corporation that has maybe put them in this position to begin with. Yeah, that's my little tirade. That's how it all loops together.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just back on my random shit. Is it so bad though that we did it this way? Like, you look at countries that didn't go after the capitalistic style, and they've stayed very.
I'm so glad you mentioned this.
I would say like a lot of them are third world, and like a lot of them. But it's weird. Like I've traveled some of these places, and you know what the people.
We're gonna get killed on the terminology here because I don't think you're allowed to call places third worlds anymore.
Yeah, I'll get executed. I get executed consistently on this, but like. Basically these countries that haven't chased this concept of the American dream, haven't gone after the whole capitalistic society, like they live a lower standard of life often, like most of the time. Like they just don't have all the things that we have. But on the flip side, I'll say whenever I'm there, I always ask the people if they're happy, and they always say totally. And I'm like, do you want more? And like, no, I don't. And I'm like, have you been to the States or Canada? Yep. Do you want to go back? No.
Yeah. So there's a couple things, man. There's so much in there to unpack. This is this weird conundrum that no one that's like pro, we need to do this great reset. We need sustainability. We need to, hammer the oil industry, blah, 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 blah. Like, if that's what you want, realize that those developing countries will never develop. They'll have no chance. Because if we're saying they can't have petroleum-based products, then they will never have our standard of life, right? Way. So by saying that you are pro this sustainable push, a requirement of that, like it or not, is to keep some of these countries down, to keep them down. Because if, like, we're basically saying that we don't want them to have cars, we don't want them to have anything petroleum based. We want to limit their access to, the main microchips that drive our world these days. Mm-hmm. Like, you are saying that, we can still get to enjoy them. Like, we've got our cars, we got our chips, we got everything we need. So we're good. We're going to try to do a little better. We're going to put a little more taxes in. Mm-hmm. But these things, we're outlawing them. We're banning them. And these other countries over here are like, well, man, like, we still have dirt roads. Like, you're telling us now that we don't get all those things because now you guys are starting to feel bad, a century later. Yeah. Right? Like, we still want those things. So that's a real conundrum that exists within that movement that no one in that movement seems to want to acknowledge. And then there's just also the fact that, like, is that whole movement utter BS, which is just going to further push inflation, drive up the cost of everything, which, again, does not impact the super wealth. Like, to see Prince Charles up there talking about, like, oh, this is a great time to reset the economy. Like, what's that dude?
Prince Charles.
He hasn't bought a carton of milk ever in his life, right? Like, it doesn't apply to them, and yet they're the ones who are
making the decision,
but also like trying to influence liberal people. Like, no, this is the right thing to do. Have the moral high ground to do this, this, and this. Yeah, it's going to cost everyone a bit more, but I think we're all going to chip in together. It's BS, man, because they don't care about that bill. But poor people in developing countries, people most at risk, they are going to care about that bill. And countries like, say, Russia, China, to some extent, India, they don't care about some of those things, man. No. And so they're using that to their advantage.
That's why they're growing so fast now.
And even like, it seems like a weird coincidence that while all this is going on, there was also some communication and some attempts by Russia and China to create a new standard currency to get everyone off of reliance on the American dollar. Because when America went through these periods of huge inflation, especially in the 70s and 80s, the only thing that maintained them was that they were still the international currency that was used for oil and all that stuff. That was the only thing that protected their dollar. And so now there's all this inflationary pressure on the American dollar, and China and Russia are trying to pull the rug out from underneath.
They pull that shootout. It's their whole bud.
And, to counter that, the Western world has always produced a narrative about, how evil China is and how evil Russia is. And, like, a lot of people don't fully understand everything that's going in Russia, Ukraine. And we're not geopolitical scientists, so we're not going to touch that too much. But there's a lot of, like, a lot of the reasons Russia is invading Ukraine has to do with controlling resources, oil, wheat, and all the other things that Ukraine has, because there is this sort of alignment of the supply chain. And I think that Russia sees what China has managed to do by just controlling supply. And not surprisingly, they're thinking, yeah, us too. And it's a terrible thing to invade a country like that. But the reason they did it is, not surprisingly, economically motivated, supply motivated.
Totally. Ukraine too. They have the neon supply, which is a global required thing, and they produce like 80% of it. Yeah, I mean, that's not actually neon, but we'll pretend that it is.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we've gone over a bunch of stuff. We're nearing the end of this. I have 3 high-level ones that I'm just going to get you to respond to. Okay. Number 1, housing market is artificially manipulated by realtors.
That's false. We are not that influential.
We're not that skillful.
I think it's influenced by. I do believe that it's influenced by big corporations who are behind the lending practices, who want to control debt and inflation swings to fit their convenience.
Number 2, eXp Realty is a pyramid scheme.
I think yes, by definition it is, but I don't know enough about their model. But if like I work for a company and then I get a certain percentage of everyone I bring underneath me, and then I get a smaller percentage of everyone they bring underneath them, and then they also get that percentage, like
it's a
little bit like a triangle.
It's a 5-tier system.
Oh, okay.
And you pay a capped amount of fees per year. It's $16,000. All 5 tiers though get $14,000 of your $16,000, so they only get $2,000 plus transactional fees. Yet they made a net profit of $300 million this year. Also, you get all of your money back in stock options.
Is this an advertisement?
No, I was digging into it last night because the numbers never made sense to me.
Yeah.
But yeah. Anyways, so eXp Realty, you tend to think it is a pyramid.
I think it has pyramid-shaped components to it, but I think it's
if you're not a realtor, I'll explain a little bit better. But so eXp Realty is another brokerage that's out there. It's all online based. You've probably seen it because it's blowing up all over the world. And like Chandler mentioned, if let's say I refer Chandler into it, I get a percentage of his business. If Chandler refers somebody else into it, he gets a percentage of their business, and I get a percentage of their business. And that goes down for 5 tiers. But once you get to the 5th tier, you can have 1,000 agents underneath that.
It's not pyramid scheme. It's multi-level marketing.
Multi-level marketing, exactly. It's always The Office where he draws it and then he like puts the pyramid around it.
No, like you're not understanding. I'm here. These two are here. Then there's 4 underneath them, and
so and then you have a cap set of fees which you can also receive back once you hit a certain production level in a stock. And so I've always felt that it was a pyramid scheme because they're giving away 80% of it in referrals. And then they're also giving you stocks, which you're effectively buying into, but they're just handing them out. And it just keeps working right now because it's on the market until the stock keeps getting value. But I don't know. I'm concerned. Anyways, number 3, luxury real estate is predominantly money laundering.
Ooh. Predominantly?
Maybe not predominantly, but a good portion of luxury real estate is money laundering.
Yeah.
And that's
but we have we're not talking like $1 million home. We're not talking even a $5 million home.
No, we're talking
luxury.
the big $10 million, $20 million homes where you're seeing like full suburbs of these things in places where all the houses are empty. And it's like, well, what's going on here? Like, if you drive through any of these fancy suburbs,
I think it's more even like, well, who bought that $35 million penthouse that's vacant? Like,
yeah, and there's tons and tons and tons of those. The other thing is, I think there's a lot of like on a lower level, there's a lot of cash that gets used to build these houses. So they're taking cash and they're cleaning it through that.
Yeah.
And then additionally, on the flip side, when people are buying and selling them, like I think it's like, I owe you $35 million, so I'm buying this house off. Like there's things like that get done a lot.
And to be clear, like laundering doesn't necessarily mean it comes from the money comes from illegal sources per se. Sometimes it's just about getting it out of one country and into another country.
Totally, exactly. Do you have any other weird ones you want to hit me with before we cap this off?
God,
before I wear my tinfoil hat out in public.
Man, I don't know. That's all I got for conspiracy theories.
Okay, COVID's fake. Thanks for listening.
No, you're gonna get us flagged. They're gonna have to put the thing on the bottom. COVID is not fake.
We'll bleep it out so nobody hears the word.
But there's some shady stuff going on around it and regulating.
Thanks for the 100 likes, guys.
The world.
This was kind of fun. Yeah, it was kind of a
reporting
big
live from the
one.
bunker. We're signing out.
Yeah.
Like, comment, subscribe, block, cancel.
Cancel us, YouTube.
All right,
bye.
Thanks so much for watching the episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. Don't forget to subscribe. But also check us out on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all the links below. Thanks again for checking us out.
When I was broke, I had rich habits. When I was broke, I had rich habits.